Today I want to tell you why I believe Resident Evil 2 is better than Resident Evil 4. Now, I want to go ahead and say a couple of things here really quick. You're going to hear me talk about pros and cons, and the last thing I want you to kind of get the impression of is that I hate Resident Evil 4 because I really don't. I think it's a fantastic game, but when I compare it to Resident Evil 2, I have to talk about the pros and cons because that's how I do every review, every game review here on the channel. And so that's what I'm going to do here. But I also have a nostalgic attachment to Resident Evil 2, and I think y'all should know that. I mean, I played this game in 1998 on an original PlayStation, and at that period of time, I mean, you got to think if you didn't have memory cards, you weren't saving your game essentially, so you would be invested into a video game pretty much all day, and that's the way I played Resident Evil 2. And it being my first horror game, I thought it was just awesome. So there's a little bit different experience there. By the time Resident Evil 4 came out in 2005, it was kind of a period where I wasn't playing a ton of video games. I was just graduated out of high school or about to graduate out of high school. So, just not playing a ton of video games at that point in my life. So, a little bit different when it comes to that stuff. But again, I want to give a fair approach, and that's what I'm going to do here in telling you that I believe Resident Evil 2 is better than Resident Evil 4. This is simply my opinion, and of course, I want to hear yours after the video. What do you think of my opinion, or what is your opinion? Leave that stuff down below. And if you like what I do, including honest game reviews, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit your notifications so you never miss one from me. Let's go and get into it. Now, the first thing I want to talk about, which is one of the things that I noticed right off the rip coming back to Resident Evil 4, is the environment. Almost everything in Resident Evil 4 looks exactly the same. It has this really dull kind of appearance where you could be looking at I don't know, greenery or shrubs or whatever on the ground, and it almost has the same visuals as the mountains. Now, it's not like it has bad visuals. It just has that appearance where everything has this kind of, I don't know, dirty brown look. It's really weird. I don't know if there's some kind of filter on the game that's making it look like that. I certainly haven't seen any kind of filter that I can, change in the game settings, but I don't know, it just has this really dull appearance to me. Now, you may be thinking, well, yeah, Resident Evil 2 is inside of a police station. And that's true. But when the light, especially from your flashlight, hits all of these different surfaces inside of the police station, it all looks different. There's some color here and there, and it just doesn't have this totally dull appearance. I actually like the aesthetics of Resident Evil 2. I think it's a little bit easier on the eyes. I think I think everything has a better contrast in the game, to be quite honest with you. And overall, I think it's also a scarier environment, which is like the pinnacle. It's the cornerstone of horror games. Now, there's a number of different reasons here why I believe this is a scarier game, talking about Resident Evil 2, but part of it is the claustrophobic feeling that you get inside of the police station. The environment itself, it could be, one or two zombies, and it's going to make you feel like you really have a tough task in front of you, especially if you play on one of the harder settings. Where in Resident Evil 4, I feel like they just kind of throw a lot at you. They throw a lot of the infected people at you. It's not really zombies, it's more like an infected cult. But regardless, they just kind of throw a bunch of people at you, and that helps build up the tension, but it doesn't have the same type of survival horror feel to me like Resident Evil 2 does. Some of the best horror games I've ever played, the atmosphere it's crucial to the game. And when it comes to atmosphere, Resident Evil 2 is a much scarier, grittier, intense type of feeling than what I get in Resident Evil 4. Now, the other part of that, and the second point that I want to talk about, is the lack of weapons, and really the lack of inventory in Resident Evil 2 makes it feel more like a survival horror game as opposed to like a third person shooter. As you go along in Resident Evil 2, you start to get some little unlocks here and there, but really, man, it's like your pistol, your knife, and that's pretty much it. I mean, you are not very well armed. And again, every good horror game, oh, yeah, pretty much every good horror game that I've ever played, that I can think of at least, you basically have very little weaponry or zero weapons, thinking about like Outlast or Stay Out of the House. Those types of games, you are very limited. Even something like Texas Chainsaw, you don't have the option to really, you know, kill the killers. You can stop them with certain things, but you really can't take them out. And so while there is a little bit of shooting aspect to Resident Evil 2, it is nothing like Resident Evil 4, where you're going to have a whole weaponry that you can upgrade and tune the weapons, and all of this stuff is at your disposal. And so it just doesn't have the same appeal to me personally like Resident Evil 2 does. Another thing that I want to talk about is the zombies in Resident Evil 2. Now, again, you may have one, two, maybe three zombies coming at you. I think at some point you might have four or five, which is like sensory overload for this game. But generally it's one or two, and these zombies, not only does the detail in the zombies look better, but the gore and the effects look better as well. Now, I will say there's parts in Resident Evil 4 when you're coming up against, the chainsaw guy, where those little cutscenes where they take you out, and it actually looks pretty cool. But I just don't get the same kind of scare factor from the regular people, not just kind of excluding Chainsaw Guy here for a minute. I don't want to ruin anything in the story either with Resident Evil 4, so I'm not going to go too far into it, but we'll use the Chainsaw Guy. Everybody pretty much knows him. He's super scary, super intense, and him by himself is actually a pretty formidable foe, but the rest of the regular infected people just don't give the same I don't know, type of appeal. And while they are super dangerous, at the same time, I just don't look at them like, oh God, I just want them to kind of stay away from me so I don't get whatever the hell they got, pretty much. While in Resident Evil 2, I don't even want to get near them sometimes because you have these really dark environments. And it's just a much different feeling. I don't know. I keep going back to that, but it is much scarier, and the zombies are much more gorier. I feel there's much more gore there than what you get in RE4. Now, here's one area Resident Evil 4 has not impressed me at all, really, and that is in the puzzles. Now, Resident Evil 2 has some really good puzzles. They're not annoying, they're not like super hard, but they take a little bit of thought in order to figure some of this stuff out. You have to really kind of learn the layout of the police station and remember where things are in order to complete your task. Where in Resident Evil 4, it's a linear experience, and you kind of go through, you might have one or two things to remember, maybe. But, they kind of always force you back into that same area. So you really don't have to necessarily revisit, certain areas of the map unless the game wants you to do that. Where in Resident Evil 2, you have to go back to certain areas and you got to remember where you are and where certain things are at in order to progress in the game further. The puzzles in Resident Evil 2 are light years better than in 4. Another thing that I want to talk about are the things that haunt you in Resident Evil 2, specifically Mr. X.
Jesus Christ!
Now, I've seen where some people really don't like this aspect of the game. Some people on PC have said that they've modded Mr. X out of the game and it made their experience better. And I don't understand that at all, to be quite honest with you. Well, yes, it can be annoying at times, especially after you've played through a couple of times. That very first experience, man, and even if you like take a break in between playing your first go around and your second go around or whatever, if you spend a little bit of time in between them, man, Mr. X is unrelenting and he's absolutely terrifying in the game. And I personally like that aspect. It's kind of like Resident Evil 3 with the Nemesis, who's always kind of there just waiting on you, right? And there's certain things that can trigger that. You could stay away from it, but at the same time, I just think it, like I said, it adds a level of tension to the game that I really appreciate. Now, Resident Evil 4, you don't really get anything that's going to constantly chase you like that. Again, it's more action packed. And while there are some antagonists for sure, nothing that is going to relentlessly chase after you like you get in RE2. And again, I just kind of find that enjoyable for a survival horror game. While it can be annoying at times, I think it just adds that extra little bit of element of just surprise, especially the first time you play it, and another level of fear to the game. Now, here's something I alluded to before, but I definitely want to cover it a little bit more in detail because, again, we're talking about survival horror. That's the way I see Resident Evil. That's the way I've always seen it, right? And so everything from, how they did first person in Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 2, the original, Resident Evil 3, survival horror at its best, right? And while I believe Resident Evil 4 is still on the cusp of it being a survival horror game, it's almost more action-oriented like RE5 and RE6, which I absolutely hated those games. These are not third-person shooters, and so while I definitely appreciate that they've gotten since away from that aspect of it, it's still, when I compare RE4 to RE2, RE2 definitely feels much more like a survival horror game for some of the reasons that I've laid out, but another one is the inventory, right? You have very limited inventory, and that's how almost every good horror experience is. Sometimes you have to leave really important things behind, remember where that stuff was, or just kind of make sure that you use things in your inventory, make sure that you mix your herbs to clear a slot. I mean, there's just a lot of different things you have to think about in Resident Evil 2, whereas in Resident Evil 4, you have a ton of different options. I mean, very rarely have I found myself in a position where I had to ditch or sell something. Really, it's only when I wanted to upgrade my guns where I had to get rid of anything at all. So with all of that said, and we finally get to the last reason that I want to talk about here, and that is the experience from the original to the remake. Resident Evil 4 feels similar. Now, I didn't spend nearly as much time in Resident Evil 4, but I still played it back in the day. It's not like I never played it, but it is not as different of an experience as the original RE2 to the remake. And I think in some ways it may add to the horror aspect, to the scary part of and how this game feels, because you have a much different perspective now in Resident Evil 2. The graphical change from 1998 to 2005 is absolutely insane. And while both remakes obviously look better running on PS5, it just, to me, Resident Evil 2 just has more of that wow factor. Like, man, this is what that game could have looked like back then. Or you know what I'm saying? Not that it would have, but it's kind of just a crazy experience hopping from the original to Resident Evil 2 now. And so I really appreciate everything they threw into this game. I think it is probably the best Resident Evil that I've played to date. Yeah, we may have to explore that a little bit more in the future. But as it stands right now, Resident Evil 2, in my opinion, is the best one that's ever been made. And I think it's better than the Resident Evil 4 remake by a little bit too. So that's kind of where I'm at with it, man. Of course, I'd love to hear your experience and just your overall opinion. If you think I'm totally off base or you agree, disagree, whatever, make sure you leave those things down in the comment section below. Again, if you like what I do, consider subscribing and hit your notifications so you never miss a video from me. Thank you guys. See you in the next one. And as always, hold them down.